discuss Black experiences, specifically in Argentina in general, which still remains a understudied experience throughout the Rio de la Plata and especially Argentina. So, but of course, for me, it was very important that I engage with what has been done. And in fact, I made sure in many ways my bibliography privileged the work that has been done by the Cordobese historians. So I do want to give a shout out to them because they've done a really good job over the years. Um, so just various levels. So again, Blackness in general, acknowledging um, that they're there, what they've been up to, going west to Cordoba, rather than entertaining or engaging Buenos Aires, I think also was a major contribution to the historiography, as within Black studies, BA is still very much privileged. So looking at Cordoba and understanding it specifically from an earlier time frame as well. Black studies in general usually look at the end of the 19th century and this transition to Blancamiento. And I wanted to look at the pre-Blancamiento period, and specifically looking at that transition from colony to republic. What does that look like? And another aspect was that I privileged her. So again, just all these nuances in terms of a gendered analysis of her experience, highlighting her and making her ultimately the central figure and understanding and seeing what Black experiences were like. But more specifically for us understanding how do we get to this so-called white nation. And so I wanted to make sure that she was the focal point, and also to dismiss the lies, the myths, however you want to describe them, as her being almost like a victim in the process, you know, just this passive agent that just happens to her. Just showing that she's actually quite strategic in her planning and her moves, especially when it comes to how she looks at and protects her family. And this is a major departure when we look at other works that have mainly focused on the Black male experience during that same time frame, and privileged the wars of independence. Their experience as well is necessary and should be told, but I wanted to kind of move beyond that and add to the discussion rather than repeat what in many ways has already been discussed. The other major contribution when I think about diaspora, especially, it was, I think, a shock for many people to keep hearing that there is such a rich Black history in Argentina. And so I've found that as I engage with other scholars in the wider diaspora, that there's so many similarities in her experiences. And in particular, because it's a gendered analysis, looking at how she is constantly part of this movement, or I should say, let me back up, that she is constantly has her family in mind. And I think that's also important that we look at where and how she moves and the way she strategizes. It's constantly, as I talk with other Black, or as I learn of other Black women experiences, it is about how you cultivate, protect, and ultimately create a better life for your children and for yourself, for your family. I remember a great quote that I read in the Telegráfico, no, I forget the name of the newspaper right now, it'll come back to me later. But one of the things that you're saying in regards to female education and women in general, it was necessary to have her educated because she was a sentinel of the family. And so that to me has allowed me to connect and see what it's like for her in Mexico, what it's like for her in the US South, what it's like for her in Puerto Rico. We all constantly are seeing this common trend that is happening. And so I think together, all of this has really allowed for a exciting, hopefully, departure and movement in the field of Black studies in Argentina, and especially for us to continue to look at other regions of not just Argentina, but the Rio de la Plata. Because what my book is also showing is that Blackness is not a monolithic understanding. And it's important and that we continue to look at and see regional differences. Um, One of the biggest finds that I had, for example, is the term Pardo, which in many ways, Reed Andrews argues that it is is still applicable to African descendants. But in Cordoba, it's actually an othering term that is applicable not only to Afro descendants, but also to those that were formerly labeled Indias or Indios, as well as Zambos, mulattoes. And so again, that is the advantage, and that is that's the advantage of looking at and seeing in a region, so we can have compare study as well. So yeah, I think just in a nutshell, all of this coming together is what created the book. And lastly, I think, and this was a last minute find, was education as a part of institutionalized whitening. And that was the last chapter. And I was well into writing the book by then, and I just so happened to go back to Cordoba and then discovered this colegio that still exists today, and just understanding what that process was for her little Black girls, and how she would also serve in the process of creating a so-called modern nation.
Thank you, Erica. And the next question goes a little bit on the memory lane, on the past, on doing the research for this book. And it goes to the issue of what have you learned as an author from engaging of the research of this book, either in the archives, either in this workshop. If I had to answer this question, would be meeting you some 12 years ago in
Yes.
in Alem, in El AGN, but you will have your own answer, of course.
Well, we could definitely start with that, which was hilarious. So in the archives, the Archivo General de la Nación, I think there's three of us in there. You, me, and Leia. I think there was at least three of us that were doing the Black history of Argentina, or Rio de la Plata. And Alex approached me after it was time, I think around 5. So
yeah, downstairs in the lockers.
In the lockers. But I noticed him kind of lurking around. So it's like, what is going on with this particular person? And so he got enough courage and he asked, and I think I don't know if it was Spanish. No, it wasn't Spanish. I don't mean to be offensive, but, as soon as he said that, I said, this is okay. This is different. It's like he's not Argentine, because Argentine just boom sometimes with some questions. So he said, I don't mean to be offensive, but are you studying the Black history of Argentina? And of course, we both got a kick out of that. And a beautiful friendship arose from the archives, and just to continue with that in Cordoba, other similar experiences as well, because clearly I stick out in Argentina and in Cordoba. What was interesting is there's not a lot of foreign, unlike BA, there are very few foreign scholars that go to Cordoba. And so the funny experience I had there was there's been about 3 American scholars that they remember actually visiting the provincial archive. One that was Robert Turkovic from 1980. One of the people were still working there. So he asked me if I knew him, which I didn't, but I knew the other 2. So it's just so interesting how small the circles are. Seth Meisel and Jesse Hinson had been there, and so I was familiar with both. But what I found with the archives in Cordoba was, first and foremost, that it's an untapped treasure. The sources are immaculate. They have the complete run of the Notaria probate records for at least 3 centuries. And so it really, I left after being there for about 2.5 years with so much stuff. I still am working through it for some articles I'm doing right now, because there's just so much stuff there. So that was the great surprise. And of course, how many archives are there as well? In particular, what I found was the university's archive, because university has existed since 1613. Well, to have, all these cases of limpieza de sangre and these students that were denied entrance and or found out that they had come from the Andes and, suspicious in terms of the limpieza de sangre, all that is there. It's just so much stuff there. So I think that was the biggest surprise in terms of the research. And it's just one of those situations where it's good old social history at its best. There's just, you got to get through it. And so I'm grateful, of course, the court cases as well. There's so much there. It was a true blessing. In terms of then looking for her, and thinking of methods, it was almost like she had been there the whole time, but it's about trying to re-look at the cases through her lens. And that's when I was able to really pick out how strategic she was, throughout the late 18th through early 19th century. And of course, the brilliant court case of the love affair between Bernabella and the priest, which has been a fan favorite in many ways. I feel like it's almost like a telenovela, but it's really good. I mean, hey, it is what it is. It's a juicy case. Yeah, so there's that as well. And then lastly, with the Rio de la Plata, like I said, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, all of you that has contributed to the critiques and the questions and all that was great. So to be able to take it at times very raw form, and to be able to go back and forth with specialists that are very well versed within your time frame, it was such a treat. And I really, I cannot stress how much I appreciated those experiences over the years. So I think what looking at and seeing the research, and that's many ways why I titled the book Hiding in Plain Sight, because she had been there this entire time. And it was just a matter of just bringing her to the surface and looking at also the household, I think, which is another major contribution to understanding larger political and social occurrences. So.
Great, Erica. And you mentioned this already a little bit in that question, the issue of the things that you are going in relation to some of these materials, the things that you are doing now. And the next question is basically what are your scholarly plans for the future? Do you want to continue with some parts of this book that you want to develop in another directions? Are working you in new subjects? Just tell us.
Yeah, so this is a COVID contingent, because I'm not sure when I can get back into the archives. So I'm actually thinking of going somewhere else with this. Initially, what I wanted to do was look at the Free Womb Project and see it in a comparative sense between Philadelphia and in particular BA/Cordoba, but BA because there's more cases, and look at these port cities and what does freedom look like and what is her experience. Of course, that would require being in the archive. Right now, it's impossible. So that's on pause. But actually, it's with the death of Maradona and a recent conversation with a few of my friends in Argentina, in which they had expressed how, how much they adored him because he was like us. He was, our Malcolm X. He was, for los negros, and they are not of African descent. That really just like pinged in my head, this comparison with Malcolm X. So I'm looking at and I'm digging more into, and I'm currently writing a book chapter on this question of blackness, and maybe I should reframe it as anti-blackness in Argentina, and in this othering process that goes throughout the 19th and early 20th century. So it's two projects depending on where, and what I can do. So yeah.
Great, thank you. And thank you for reminding us of Diego as well. So we're gonna go with our next author, and again, think about your questions for Professor Edwards and for the other audio authors, and we're gonna go to the questions all the way to the end. Now we have Chef Sean Wei with a woman, a man, and a nation, and we can see there in his backdrop both El Restaurador and Mariquita. Welcome, Chef. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you, Alex. It's wonderful to see all of you. Thanks to Fabricio for putting this all together. Also to Viviana and Alex for helping out. It's great to see all of you as well. It would have been fun to see you all in person, but this is a way we can get more people in. It's also great to see my mentor, Donna Guy, here with us, and a couple of former students as well. So first of all, I just want to say in writing this book, my goal was to take an empathetic approach to both Mariquita and Juan Manuel. I wanted as much as possible to understand in their own terms. In my head, I thought, if they could pick up my book, if Mariquita could pick up my book or Juan Manuel could pick up my book, I hope that at least to some degree that they would recognize themselves within my pages. I know that's a tall task. Rosas was living in England when Bilbao's biography of him came out. So he was alive when the first full biography came out, and he just trashed it. He said it was full of so many errors, he couldn't even bear to look at it. But I still, that was kind of one of my goals. If Mariquita or Rosas picked it up, I would hope they could recognize themselves, at least in part. Beyond my empathetic approach that I attempted, one of my main goals was to introduce Mariquita Sanchez to the English-speaking world. In Spanish, she had been well represented, even during her lifetime. More recently, Maria Sáenz Quesada published a fine biography of her in the 1990s. Graciela Baticore published another one in 2011. But there was very little on Mariquita in English. She's often cited in relation to the English invasions of 1806 and 1807, where she famously described the beautiful uniforms and attractive legs of the Scottish Highlander regiment that occupied Buenos Aires. There were some notable exceptions. My fellow University of Arizona classmate, Marie Francois, used information about daily household items that she found in Mariquita's letters. Monica Surmuk had a nice chapter on Mariquita in her 2001 book on women in Argentina. And I featured Mariquita fairly prominently in a chapter in my first book, The Case of the Ugly Suitor. But I was looking forward to a fuller introduction of this remarkable woman to the English-speaking world. Juan Manuel de Rosas, of course, is one of the best known and most controversial figures in Argentine and Latin American history. Rosista historiography is massive, to say the least. At the same time, there was a need for a fresh retelling of Rosas's history. I got the contract for this book around 2012, 2013. Actually, can't remember the exact year. My editors would probably tell me it was even before that. But there hadn't been a biography written of Rosas for quite a while. In English, the last one had been John Lynch's 1982 classic. But so much had changed with regard to Rosas since 1982, driven largely by developments among Argentine scholars. As many of you know, beginning in the 1970s, but especially in the 1980s, and we could go back to the 1890s really, but we don't have time. I don't have time to cover all of that. But in the 1970s and especially in the 1980s and afterward, Argentine historians had been very busy elucidating new facets of the Rosas era. And the results were astounding and amazing, and they challenged some of the foundational beliefs about Rosas and his era. Again, the list is too long to cite, but just to cite a few things. Jorge Meyer's 1995 Order and Virtue book talked about Republican elements in Rosismo that deserved closer attention. Jorge Hellman pointed out that contrary to widely held views, Rosas's leadership style was not based on his supposed absolute power wielded on his estates. Instead, a close look at his ranching activities and his relations with those living on his estates revealed that Rosas had to use the art of negotiation, art of consensus building, and he employed similar strategies when he became governor. He had to employ those with the legislature, indigenous peoples, justices of the peace, among other groups. And he did it with an eclectic mix of ideas that included Catholic identity, egalitarian and republican discourse, as well as federalism. Scholars such as Gabriel Di Meglio have also shown that dating at least from the late 19th century, we can include Lyman Johnson in there as well. The popular classes exercised a certain measure of power and influence in society. And that was precisely the power that, that they exercised is what made Rosas have to negotiate with the plebe. But he also had to negotiate with the elite ranchers as well. So while I was already well into writing my book when Raul Fradkin and Jorge Hellman's monumental biography of Rosas came out in 2015, which brought a lot of this scholarship together. So my overall goal was to introduce Mariquita to the English-speaking world, to provide a fresh look at Rosas. I think another part of my contribution is the dual biographical approach itself, which allowed me to tell the story of Argentina's beginnings through female and male eyes. I would also add that I attempted to connect the story of Mariquita and Juan Manuel to hemispheric and world events as much as possible, and to show that although some see Argentina as being at the el fin del mundo, the end of the world, it was very much part of hemispheric and global processes. So I'll leave that there for now.
Thank you, Jeff, and also thank you for not making me repeat the question for Erica. For those of you who are joining, the questions are posted there also by Fabricio in the chat. The next question goes, as I mentioned, a little bit on the memory line and the memory lane, and goes into what you have learned as an author by working on this book, in the making of this book.
All right, thank you. Well, first of all, I loved this project. It kept me interested, kept me engaged. I loved it all the way until the end, all the way until I got to the author checklist. Then it became very tedious, but I'm very grateful to the University of New Mexico Press for their work on this. So I was reminded, I think similar to some of the things Erica said, I was reminded during this whole process, this years-long process, of how grateful I am for the archivists at the AGN in Buenos Aires, at the HPBA in La Plata, directors of museums and other places. Some of the most interesting tidbits of the book, of course, big chunks of it are from these places, but some of the most interesting tidbits in the book came as a result of, just getting help, getting pointed to certain things from archivists, as well as museums. Sometimes, as Eric also talked about, meeting Alex, you meet people in the archives that help you. One man, when he found out what I was doing, he brought me, the next day, he brought me an old book by De Lepiane about Mariquita, Dos Patricias Ilustres, and he just gave me the book. It's this really old book. And that helped me. I mean, I had access to some of the things in there in other ways, but it just shows how you can get help not only from archivists but also people that are in the archives. So Rosas is still, Mariquita, not so controversial. Rosas still a controversial topic throughout the years, running into people, talking to people. Even sometimes when I thought I was being very careful in the way I talked about Rosas, I, on at least 2 occasions, got kind of a little bit of a tongue lash from people who loved Rosas way more than I did, apparently. But that was also good to see and to experience. I was able to talk to a few of Rosas's descendants and get some perspectives from them. And the story I tell in the conclusion, that really happened, where somebody heard that I was writing about Rosas and wanted to come and visit me in the archive, And this person showed up one day. I happened to be out of town, and they asked the archivists, what I was looking at. At that point, I was looking at stuff on Mariquita Sanchez. I was looking at records from La Sociedad de Beneficencia. And when the person found out I was studying her, she said, "Oh, I don't want to meet him anymore." So, meaning me. And so, that was, again, Rosa is still a very powerful, still very controversial figure. And that story, made me think even more, I think it's a good thing that I'm pairing these two one-time friends, later enemies, together. And finally, another thing I learned is the utility of taking a writing leave. I don't know if the book would be done had I not been able to take a sabbatical where I just wrote for a number of months. Again, I went home to Hawaii, which is where I'm from, stayed with my brother. My editors debated, thought I was just going for fun, but that was a key moment. So I encourage all of you, if you or shifting courses around, whatever you need to do, going away to write is an amazing, way more amazing than I ever thought it would be. And maybe a lot of you have that experience, but that was key for me. So those are some of the things I learned.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. And writing leaves. That's, what can I tell? Our last question for you, that one was on the past, this one is on the future. What's your plans, your scholarly plans? Because life continues,
Yeah, so right now I'm I took a little breath after my book came out. I worked on some courses that I didn't neglect, but worked on doing better in the classroom. But I do have one project that I want to pursue that is part of this same time period, and that is the 1845 Batalla de Obligado, the Battle of Obligado. So my tentative title, World War in the Rio de la Plata. It's not quite that, but a little bit. You got England and France, combined fleet, trying to force open the river trade. You've got Rosas, you have Uruguay, you have Brazil involved, Paraguay, the United States looking in from the outside, kind of, trying to figure out what to make of this, this European intervention. So I think I would like to do either an article on that, and who knows if it, so before the battle and after, right? So it could go to the whole Guerra Grande, 1838 to 1852. I'm still not sure if, so I think for sure, at least an article on that. It could turn into a small book again. So nobody take that title, World War in the Rio de la Plata.
No, and I guess you're following the 20 pesos bill, which, as far as I remember, has on the one side Rosas and on the other side the Batalla de Obligado, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Good.
Yep. Yeah. So that's one thing. I'm also interested, as I mentioned, many of you know, I'm from Hawaii. I was born and raised in Hawaii, and there is a Pacific turn. There is a Pacific turn in the historical field, and I have a few ideas of how to connect Buenos Aires with Honolulu. So both in the early 19th century, but also in the late 19th century. So that's something that I would love to do. Again, part of showing how Buenos Aires is part of a bigger picture. And if I can connect my two homelands, if you will, then that would be a real treat. And I have a couple of ideas on how to do that, but and some documents, because I've gone back home to Hawaii. I've gone to the archives in Honolulu, and there's stuff in there about Argentina. So that's another possibility. If any of you have ideas, I'm happy to listen on that.
Oh, I will write to you about that, because I'm in that turn as well. But let's.
We might have to go to Hawaii, Alex.
I will sacrifice.
Yeah, so those are a couple ideas I have.
Well, thank you very much, Chef. Thank you very much, Professor Chongwei. And we're going to transition to the last and the third of the authors for today, Professor Billy Acri. and Staging Frontiers, the making of modern popular culture in Argentina and Uruguay. Good morning, Billy.
Good morning. Good morning.
Great to see you.
Likewise, likewise. Sounds like the Buenos Aires Honolulu connection is going to attract a few people.
Oh, sign me in.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
what has been the major contribution of your book for the scholarship on the Rio de la Plata, or a scholarship of Atlantic Studies, or the scholarship in your case on print culture as well?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to say is just a big thanks to everybody, to Fabricio for the organization, you and Viviana for facilitating the conversation. It's great to share the screen stage with Erica and with Jeff Shumway. I really appreciated the conversations yesterday. And thanks to everybody for signing on and sharing a part of your Saturday afternoon or evening or morning with us. I would say that the overarching contribution of the book is centering a transnational focus on the emergence of popular culture that drove the development of cultural marketplaces and exchanges, and that facilitated the crossing of lines of ethnicity, class, and occasionally race throughout the late 1800s on into the 20th century. And I say transnational in a couple senses. So the first is my regional focus on the history of popular culture in Uruguay and Argentina. It's something that you can't focus solely on one or the other, at least in the 1800s, early 1900s. The second sense comes from the hemispheric perspective. That's the focus of primarily the second chapter, where I study these hemispheric travelers, these performers, entertainers, and circus families, professors of physics and the occult, a bunch of crazy stuff. People who made their way from Europe and the United States to South America, but specifically to the Rio de la Plata, which had become sort of the place to be by 1860 in terms of sort of making a run, making a profit in the world of entertainment. And then the last sense of the transnational focus comes from this transatlantic tension that comes to the fore in chapter 6, that looks at just who and what can be a cultural ambassador for the nation, be it Argentina, Uruguay, outside of Latin America. I wanted to say, for those who haven't seen the book, just a brief snippet of what this book is about. It centers on the Creole drama phenomenon, which enjoyed its heyday from 1884 to around the turn of the century. And this is a phenomenon that began with a dramatic adaptation of this page-turning narrative, Juan Moreira. And this adaptation, sort of these gaucho plays, became the main attraction of circus shows through the turn of the century. And they ended up becoming one of the most widely attended forms of entertainment prior to 1900. And they tell similar stories, right? Oftentimes, the honest native son character, persecuted by a corrupt system of justice, sometimes sent to fight along the frontier. Themes of honor, revenge are often present. And for us, it seems like a sort of a simplistic tale of country life under siege, or just pure nativism. But the performance of the frontier in this way became the backbone of an entire entertainment industry. And it marked, at least the argument of the book is that it marked this turning point in the region's cultural history. So that's the center of the narrative arc. Leading up to that is this focus on the entertainment landscape prior to that moment, right? So from the late colonial period throughout the 1800s. And then the second, or the last third of the book, focuses on sort of the imprint that these dramas left after the decline in the 1900s. And there I turn to how they created a theater-going public, how they fueled the explosion of sociedades criollas, these Creole clubs, first in Uruguay, then in Argentina, and later in Brazil, and how the stories infused the first silent films, first narrative films, and radio theater in the 1920s and 30s. And so within this scheme, there's several historiographies that the book engages. One is history of dance and carnival and music festival, some of the work on film and political movements. On the other hand, there's theater and performance history, much of which comes from this theater studies group, HETEA, in Buenos Aires. And then there's literary history, primarily focused on Gauchesque narrative and popular literature that flooded the market starting in the 1870s. But one of the shortcomings of that scholarship, even though I couldn't have done the book without it, is its nationally constrained focus. So the Argentine theater historians focus on Argentine theater history. And the Uruguayan anthropologists who follow these Creole societies in Uruguay don't connect them really with their Argentine or Brazilian counterparts or the deeper regional history that they share. And so that transnational piece is really central. And again, it comes from sort of the nature of following this movement of entertainers that came from abroad or local group from that to Chivilcoy, to Buenos Aires, Rosario, Salto in Uruguay, or Mercedes, Uruguay, Colonia, Montevideo, this performance circuit that they all followed throughout the 1800s and on into the 1900s. And so that's what I would say about the historiographical contribution.
Hey, thank you, Billy. And you represent really well this in maps, I mean, in pointing at the places of where people and actors and troops were moving across, indeed. On the making of this book, what have you learned by engaging in this research?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo one of the points that both Erica and Jeff made, and that is what I've learned from the people that I've been able to interact with over the course of this project. This was a long time in the making. I started sort of playing with this idea in 2006, 7, 8, but I didn't really start doing the research until 2010 in a sustained way. And so just gives you a sense of how long this took. So start to finish 9+ years, right? With some gaps along the way. But I learned a whole lot from conversations that I had with you, with Alex, Fabricio, Jeff Shumway, Jeff Erbig, Mike Huner. I don't think Brian Bockelman is on the call this morning, is he? I didn't see him there, but conversations at this workshop. I haven't been back in quite some time, but it's such a wonderful community. Conference panels with Paulina Alberto, Julia Sariel, Jessica Stites-Moore, correspondence with Rebecca Pite, Ezequiel Aramovsky, students, Soledad is on the call. And then as Jeff was saying, editors at UNM Press. I mean, the book is part of the Dialogo series. And so working with Chris Lane was a real joy. And it was totally different from the first book that I wrote. I really had such an amazing experience working with Chris, and at that time with Clark Whitehorn. I think I would sum up in 2 ways, sort of what I confirmed and what I took away from the project, right? So the first thing is that everyday things, and this is going to sound perhaps obvious, but everyday things that are heterogeneous and so seemingly mundane and repetitive can be incredibly transformative, but also incredibly difficult to find record of. And I'll just give a quick example. So I worked a lot in public and private archives, as well as with a handful of private collectors. And newspaper collections from towns and cities across the region, they ended up being one of the best ways to follow the movement of entertainers, audience reactions, the variety of diversiones públicas. There you can see sort of the increased frequency and variety of entertainment options over time. And these point to sort of the ordinary and the mundane of what it meant to go out. And yet that the very daily frequency of being able to choose from this variety that was increasing year after year really points to the power of popular culture to transform daily life. At the same time, we know that the newspaper record is woefully incomplete. And that's where a theater archive comes into the picture, posters and ads and correspondence between authors and actors. And private collectors were very important for me too. Two in particular, the totally disorganized bunch of stuff at the Sociedad Criolla Elias Regules, which is outside of Montevideo, which was actually the first Creole club that was formed in 1894, and it ended up becoming the model for a lot of others, and it still exists today. And working there it was really eye-opening because they have thousands of photographs and all kinds of information records from the early members. But it was eye-opening in the sense too of all the nationalist overtones that surround these spaces. And then the second space that was a private collector's space was a guy's one-bedroom apartment in Montevideo. And this particular person has potentially the most complete collection of circus documentation in the region. And he guarded that collection with his life's honor. And to this day, I don't know the extent of what he has. I spent basically 3 or 4 days there with him deciding what to give to me that I could look at while his cat crawled all over me, and I'm allergic to cats too. So it was an interesting experience. The second thing that I'll mention is that, I said the book took 9 years from start to finish, and toward the end of it, and I think Jeff pointed this out too. And since it was published, I've thought a lot about the time and energy and the resources that go into a project like this on one hand, and then the payoff on the other. And I love the book, no doubt about it. But I'm also really eager to explore other ways of doing really substantial, robust scholarship and sharing our work that can perhaps get more public traction or reach more readers. And so that's kind of the second thing I've been thinking a lot about since the publication.
Thank you, Billy. And that's probably the question that you had yesterday. It's the meaning of your question that you had yesterday for Jeff and the others about the issue of we're going to 20 archives during 10 years and so on, and the output of that. Now going to the future, and with that, this is the last question. What are your scholarly plans on this?
Yeah, so there are scholarly plans. I have 2 threads from the book that I haven't been able to tie yet. Over the past year, I've worked with the translator on the translation of it. So it's coming out in Argentina this year, which I'm happy about. The
Prometeo.
2 threads, Prometeo. So I'm really happy that they're still publishing books, right? In this environment, in this situation. The 2 threads, one is focused on Gabino Ezeiza, who was the region's most famous payador in the late 1880s, 1890s, ended up giving shows that were massive attractions, Afro-Argentine payador. And then the other is on chantas and charlatans, and the history of con artists in the region. And so I came across all these con artists during the research for this book, and I tell the story of some of them in abbreviated form, but I'm really drawn to looking more into them and the receptions they got, and how they conned people and the connections with corruption. So that's sort of a lingering thing. As far as using the book as a platform or thinking about the future, I've always been drawn to the enduring impact of ephemeral experiences and practices. And so I'm going to stick with that as a broad interest for the next project that I'm interested in, that I hope will have a significant collaborative component. And that is centered on the history of street cultures in Latin America from independence to the present. And so this is where I connect, you know, what I was saying at the end of the last question to what I see as an ideal opportunity to explore possibilities with presses for developing sort of a public-facing digital framework architecture, right, where we can put up things related to sound and image and movement of interactions that take place in the public space of the street that you cannot put in print, combined with print material, a book, although I'm eager to explore a much more concise book form, sort of like the short form book that a couple presses are working with these days. And so that's kind of the idea. I'd be eager to talk to anybody about street cultures and potential interest in that too going forward. So thank you again.
Hey, thank you, Billy. As always, a pleasure to talk with you. And now we're gonna move to, and I'm gonna refrain myself to ask questions because I call this guy every month. So we're gonna pass this part to the questions and answer. If I'm correct, Fabricio, you are gonna be telling who goes first.
Yes.
That way you can use the raise hand function in reactions. So you go down in reactions, you click there and it shows raise hands. So you raise hands and Fabricio is gonna tell you.
Yeah, and we have already a question by Victor Isaacson in the chat, and then I'll keep the list. We already have Julia and Rebecca there. But Victor, if you like to ask your question that you placed earlier in the chat, go ahead. It's the time.
We also have another question if you go up on the chat from Adriano.
Well, Adriano, okay. Oh yes, it's true. All right.
Yeah. So yeah, that would be second. Yeah.
Victor, are you there?
Well, yes, I am. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all. Hope everybody's okay. My question goes to Eric. I was listening to you when you were talking about the choice of your subject. And then you said, oh, you know, I don't want to go back to the same questions about, you know, wars and how Black people in Argentina disappeared during the wars. So I was thinking, do you think it's possible to connect your research experience of women with military service? Like in your research, not by repeating the questions that have been already made, but by adding new questions which could be related to pensions or civil identification or civic rituals, things like that, in which I believe women participated as well as men.
Hi, Victor. It's great.
Hi, Eric.
It's a great question. So just to reframe it, so I'm a bit more clear, it's not so much that I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't, well, let me rephrase. I just didn't want to engage at all, at least for this book, in regards to the military. I just felt that, again, it had already been told in the sense accurately as well. I'm not critiquing what has been out there. You know, we've got Baruki who's done a great job in his book. So I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is instead, I just wanted to look at, and where I found her most in the archive was in the household. So I centered the household. That being said, that's a great question. So recently I co-authored a piece with Florencio Guzman about Maria Remedios Evache, who was the war hero and took 6 bullets, whipped 9 days, made it back to BA, successfully petitioned for her pension during the Rosas aid. I mean, and today we have the Dia de los Afro-Argentinos to commemorate her contributions to the nation. So definitely there were Black women that partook in the wars of independence and the civil wars that also followed. I do think, of course, in her case, she's very much an exception because most women were not on the battlefield. One thing I did find, however, in terms of her contributions was that she was very much active in donating. I found a list actually of women and men, but Pardos in particular and African descendants who donated money to the cause. So she is there, at least in terms of a more peripheral, not so much centrally located on the battlefield in Cordoba. I did find her doing that. And that could be another way to look at how she participated, her civic engagement overall in terms of the war efforts that came about. So yes, that could actually be an interesting article. I think Viviana and I were thinking about maybe doing something. So thank you for reminding.
No, just a curiosity. During your research, did you find anything like a Libro de Oro, like something like a contribution of women to military campaigns or something like that?
I did not find that. No, not for Cordoba. I want to stress, not for Cordoba. I did not find that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you very much. And we continue. I think that Adriano didn't have really a question, but a reference. The reference has been duly noted by Jeff Shumway. And we proceed then. Julia.
Hi, everybody. I really enjoy these presentations and the books. My question is for everybody, and it's about the reception of your book in Argentina. I realize that you're, and the Rio de la Plata region, I should say. I realize that they haven't yet been translated, but still, I'm curious about Erica, that there's still generally the perception about white Argentina, although that's been changing. But then also if there's the Afro-Argentine population would be centered in Buenos Aires. So what about Cordoba, and how has that been perceived? Because your book has gotten a lot of attention in the United States, but what about in Argentina? Jeff, you mentioned a little bit about doing the research and how people have very strong views about Rosas and sometimes were helpful or not. I'm wondering how people are thinking about what you've actually written and the reception of that. And Billy, about yours, I'm wondering about how's your book being perceived in relationship, especially to Adamovsky's recent work. I know that yours is different, but they're related. So thank you.
So from, like you said, at this point right now, it hasn't been translated. And so I've gotten a lot of people asking, when will it be translated? Which, to be frank, I'm not sure. But from the few Argentine scholars that I have been in contact with and that have written me, it has been received positively. And overall, they have found, especially the use of the household and my concentration of Cordoba, to be a welcome addition to the historiography. So that's been very, very gracious on their end. I actually had one who's a musicologist, and she does the same time frame and looks at Black participation in the music scene in the church. And after reading about Bernabella, she was like, "Dang it, how did I miss that?" You know, it was in the so that was a fun exchange. For African descendants and mainly in BA, what I've noted, and I am very much in contact with them, but more on a personal level, not an academic level. Being Black in BA, or in Argentina, I do share some of the experiences they unfortunately have to deal with as well. So I think in general, it's just thank you for continuing to tell the story. It's somewhat maybe anticlimactic when they read about how it's about you know, some of these Black women that successfully are able to whiten themselves in many ways. But it's still the story, and so they appreciate it. So I haven't really received anything too negative at this point. We'll see what happens once it's translated into Spanish.
I don't know, was I next or is it Billy that's next?
Go ahead, Jeff. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've gotten some response from people. Gabriel Di Meglio read the book and, you know, seemed to enjoy it, seemed to indicate he, you know, if he can find even one or two things new in it for him, that's satisfying for me. But he seemed to like it, but I haven't got a whole lot. I was in Argentina last March, right when COVID blew up. And I had a bunch of copies of my book, and I was going to, you know, give them to a bunch of people. Then I got quarantined in my hotel and had to change my flight. So I was actually gonna, yeah, so that I was going to, but I haven't heard much beyond what I heard back from Gabriel about it. And I hope I like it. I mean, the people that are really into the Rosas historiography, you know, they're going to see a lot of themselves. And I cite, you know, tons of those authors. And if I can contribute a few grains for them, I'll be happy about that. But haven't heard a ton of feedback from Argentina yet.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Julia. I think it's a great question. You know, I was in Argentina right when Aramotzky's book came out, and it was just prior, I think, 4 months prior to publication. At that point, I mean, I was really pleased with sort of the level of interest, just in speaking with colleagues there and people at archives, and you know what I was doing. But I guess the jury's out in terms of the reception, right? You know, we'll see what happens with the publication in Spanish, and I'm really happy about that. I think it's obviously difficult in terms of logistics and economics to get books from here to readers there and to Uruguay, and so I'm happy about that. I had planned, as Jeff was saying, to take a bunch of copies that I promised people in archives when it was published, and haven't been able to since. I mean, it's this past year with publication of books, you know, the pandemic books and their reception it's a mystery question for me. It seems that in some instances we're reading more books, or people are reading more, but in others it seems difficult to gauge, you know, the way books are circulating in the classroom, for instance, with so much going online, at least in the US. So I'm eager to see the reception, and you know, happy to take copies when I can to people.
Thank you very much, Billy. And we have right now Rebecca, Bridget, Soledad, and Mike. If you want I keeping the track of the list here on the queue, please use the raise your hand and it will be added, or enter in the chat, it will be added to the list. All right, Rebecca.
Hello, everybody. Well, this was a fascinating panel, and I also wanted to thank Julia for letting a whole bunch of us who hadn't been here previously know about this event, because I'm just delighted to hear about all your new books, and have several of them already, and we'll have all of them soon. So I'll go maybe in reverse order. Billy, I think that point that you made is one that I've been thinking a lot about too at the end, in terms of all this time we spent doing our research, and then para qué, like, right, like that, like for a small group of us who really care, but then like, what about beyond that? I have found and been really fortunate to find that when I published my book in Spanish on Doña Petrona, I had this audience that I really couldn't ever get in the United States, and this deep interest because people there cared. And I suspect with all of your books that is very much going to be the same. And so that was affirming in the way that the English language book was not, frankly. But I still think there's more beyond the book, right? I'm really intrigued by your Street Life project, and I'll just mention to everyone right now, I've started collecting and at some point in my life want to create kind of an online digital archive of the Rio de la Plata region. And, you know, Billy, you've been extremely generous, as has Bridget, in sharing postcards that you found in your own research. And so postcards, one particular genre that I think has some interesting contributions to street life. But I'm also looking at photographs and advertisements and all sorts of things. So if anyone else is interested in that, I really think, and kind of building on the panel yesterday, some kind of collective effort around that might eventually be much more productive than any one of us trying to do it by ourselves. That was a little bit more of a comment, but Billy, if you have thoughts on that, I would welcome it, or anything I said. Jeff, I'm so thrilled. I remember meeting you in the archive and you telling me, or maybe it was at a conference after we long knew each other, about your book on Mariquita Sanchez. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the kind of challenges and payoffs of telling a parallel biography. I think that is a really kind of innovative method, especially about someone who has dominated Latin American historiography and someone else who, you know, like many female protagonists, even the kind of most prolific among them, gets, you know, kind of short shrift. So if you would speak a little bit about that. And then Erica, I was really struck by the ways in which, when you were talking about the subjects of your book, you often use the singular she and looking for her in the archive. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the beautiful way you put it, that a lot of Black women's focus on cultivating, creating, and protecting their family. And what, if any, divergences you saw in their stories, and perhaps did that have to do with their respective relationships within their families, or something else? Thank you so much.
So I'll just start off really quickly. Thanks so much for those comments, Rebecca. And I'd love to talk more about this sort of collective digital project that you're leading up. I mean, I think this is such a, speaking of us, right, on the Zoom call, it's such a cool community. And you know, Fabricio, Alex, Viviana, and all the people who participated on a much more regular basis than I did in the workshops over the years have made it that. But I think there's a way to harness the power of the community, perhaps in other ways, right, in other creative ways. And you know, as I think hinted at yesterday, we're at a book slam celebrating books, and I love that. I think we have to do that, of course. But I'm also maybe fearful, and this goes back to what I was saying about, you know, thinking of the payoff and the time invested in the resources to carry out projects like the projects that we do. I'm just fearful of the sustainability of that in the future, given sort of at least the state of play in the US world of academia. Because I think there are lots of things that are happening, thinking of graduate education and the ways that particularly humanities or humanistic social sciences are functioning, or can function going forward. And I'm wondering if there are perhaps other ways we can devote energies to collective or collaborative efforts that can broaden the type of scholarship that we do, and again reach other or different people. So I guess that's what I would just say to that point.
Well, thanks, Rebecca, for that. Yeah, I remember meeting you too. That was fun. It's always nice to run into people doing their research down there. So some of the challenges of this, well, I can just talk a little bit about the origin of the project. I was originally planning on just doing a biography of Mariquita Sanchez, just her alone. Then before I really even got started, I heard that a very prominent scholar was considering doing a Mariquita project. You know, I didn't have details, I didn't have confirmations, but again, this was very early. I hadn't really started anything, you know, super concrete, hadn't made a big trip to Argentina yet. And so that just kind of said, you know, I hadn't started it, I hadn't invested a ton of time, and that's what made me kind of think differently. You know, even back then, I knew that, you know, Rosas had been revised quite a bit in Argentina, and I knew that he was, you know, friends with Mariquita when they were young, and then they became enemies. I kind of knew the basic story from things I read about Mariquita, and then it just hit me. Hey, I'm gonna tell the story of these two friends who became enemies, and I'm going to use that as a backdrop to tell the history of Argentina's beginnings. So anyway, that's kind of how it came about. You know, rightly or wrongly, I didn't do any big data research. I didn't call this person and say, hey, you know, are you going to do this? That's just kind of how it came about. The editors I talked to were pretty excited about it. I was talking to an editor in Argentina who, when she heard that I was thinking about that, she was really excited about, you know, this dual biography idea. Anyway, so other challenges, just 2 historiographies. I mean, obviously, had I done a biography on her alone, you know, I'd be delving into a lot more depth on more topics. So the choice of a dual biography brings with it challenges, part of which is you have to decide what things you're going to leave out, because you can't have this. I already was quite over what New Mexico wanted. New Mexico, you know, this is in the Dialogo series, and New Mexico wanted a certain 1,000 number of words, and I went quite a bit over that, and they were fine with it. But so you have to be a little more focused. But the dual biography made me able to focus, because it was kind of her life and his life put together, 2 lenses, and whatever came into focus through those 2 filters, that's kind of where I went. So that helped me sort of focus in. But, you know, the double historiography, you know, you're writing along, you have the historiography of her and everything she's involved in, the historiography of him and everything he's involved in. Came Venus Islands question. There's a whole historiography on that, but, you know, I have to decide, okay, this is a big deal, but how much of it am I going to put in? Do I want to just drop a hint? Did Rosas try to sell it to the British or exchange it in exchange for the Bering loan being forgiven? I mean, you know, there's all these little debates that are going on. So I think that was a challenge, just trying to deal with the dual historiographies. Then balancing, am I being balanced in my approach? Am I falling into the easy trap of she's the shining liberal reformer, and he's the characterized evil dictator? You know, I had to try to, again, this empathetic approach, you know, not excusing, you know, all of the scholars in Argentina that talk about this, they say we're not excusing the violence, etc., but nevertheless, you still have to do the history. You have to put Rosas in his context. You have to see the big picture. And so that was a struggle, you know, balancing. It came up in the Rio de la Plata workshop. Somebody raised the issue of naming. So this was a nice thing that impacted my, you know, because I use Mariquita a lot, and Argentines use Mariquita, but it came up to say, okay, well, are you making this woman diminutive by using only her first name? You know, women have only their first names, and, you know, and since Argentines call her Mariquita so often, I hadn't even thought about that, but, you know, it caused me to make sure. And one of the reviewers at New Mexico also kind of brought that up as well. And so that made me, again, I in the introduction, I addressed that and say, hey, in Mariquita, this is how she's known. It would be kind of like saying, you must say Ernesto Guevara de la Serna anytime you mention Che, or is he Che, or is he what else is he? So I kind of pushed back, but in my introduction, I wanted to make sure I'm giving her due as a powerful woman when it came to naming. So these are some of, I mean, I could go on, but I'll leave it there. But thanks for the question. Hopefully that gives some answer.
So thank you, Rebecca, for that great question. And yeah, you know, I did want to, and I continue to refer to her as she or her, because I guess it's just, again, to really center her and her contributions to Argentina. So yeah, were there any outliers or such? So I was shocked to find that if I were to just be broad, paint a broad stroke, the answer would be no. I constantly found her some way, shape, or form always advocating and or protecting, to a certain extent, her family members. That did not always lead to successful whitening efforts. In fact, and I I have to give a shout out again to the workshop who told me not everybody's going to become white. So make sure that you deal with that in the book and address these other circumstances where, you know, women are also looking to protect their family, but aren't necessarily claiming whiteness or becoming Indian. And so I made sure I added a couple of those cases to kind of juxtapose the overall experience and give a more complete experience of Black women in Cordoba. And in one in particular was, you know, someone who very similar to Bernabella, but her child was being abused by a priest, but she didn't go to the lengths to try and pass or try and become a señora. Instead, she broke the laws. She went to various jurisdictions. She didn't care in order to protect her daughter from a priest who was threatening to take her to Buenos Aires. And constantly the ecclesiastical as well as civil authorities, you know, came down on her, like, how dare she come to me and, you know, so abruptly without a defensor de los pobres, doesn't she know any better? Doesn't even have, you know, the bona fides to even address me. All these, you know, just really demeaning accusations came to her, even though she was desperate to save her daughter. In the end, she can't. So the daughter is, you know, for I would assume taken by this priest. But either way, what I'm finding, you know, is this need and this willingness to protect her family came at all costs. And also some of the things that I noticed is that meant also at times she herself was a slave holder. And that's the wealth that she built for her own family. And so I have this one particular Isadora who lived in a very prominent part of town, and she had 5 or 6 slaves and would sell and buy and sell and buy, and ultimately her son was able to become a businessman, which is very rare for a Pardo to be able to even have that that title and that occupation. She did this, you know, willingly, clearly, in order to amass wealth. And in another case, someone who had passed, I found this after the book was out. I was so upset, but it would have been a great opener for chapter 2, but she had passed and she was so upset over the fact that her daughter now wanted to marry a slave. And so to what extent does the daughter know that her mother is passing, but she is just so upset about this notion that her, you know, she had passed, she's living in the right side of town. The only one who's living that we know of, Tichina Ferreira did a great job with tracing the 1813 census. And so we know from her great work, we know she's probably the only part of that lived very much in the Plaza Mayor. And now it's all being almost threatened. And so what I'm seeing is that protecting the family came at all costs. If that meant to whiten or become indigenous to evade slavery, fine. If that meant I had to buy and sell slaves, fine. If that meant, you know, that I was going to stop my daughter from potentially ruining the family name or all that I've achieved, fine. I did what I took, and I took what I had to in order to protect the family. That's the mindset I got from her while I continued to piece together this book.
Thank you, Erica. We have now the list that I have comes Bridget, Soledad, Mike, Hunter, Alex, and Viviana. We are at 1:20. I already announced that we, like yesterday, we're gonna extend the meeting till 1:45, adding 15 minutes more, so we can go over all the questions in the Zoom list. But I think that we are about the questions that we're going to be able to cover here. So without taking more time, Bridget, please ask your questions.
Hi, I just have a question for Jeffrey, and this is actually not my question. It's from my mother, who read your book and loved it. And she was so excited when she heard that I'd be having an opportunity to talk to you today. She made sure that I would ask you this question. And she wanted to know what happened to Rosa's land. after his family, if it had gone to his family, what happened to his land, and what has become of that, and how that was with his legitimate and illegitimate families. She was very concerned about this, and I thank you for humoring my mother.
Well, your mom is my new best friend. Tell her hello, and I'm glad she enjoyed it. So a couple of things there. First of all, I found it very interesting a few years later when Sarmiento bragged, about after Rosas was overthrown, Domingo Sarmiento, bragged about going into Rosas's bedroom, and just sort of like taking over this space, and that his estate was torn down, and there's a park there now. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, like they put a statue of Sarmiento right where Rosas's bedroom would have been, something like that. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there to look at. So his lands, for the first little bit, he was friendly, or he had pretty good relations with Urquiza, the guy that took over and wrote the new constitution. And Urquiza arranged for Rosas to get, ironically, Rosas did not prepare monetarily to go into exile. He prepared documents and things like that. He did not take a ton of money with him. So he was hoping to get revenues from his lands, his huge land holdings. And Urquiza arranged for some money to get transferred. But once Buenos Aires sort of rebelled against Urquiza, and by the way, Mariquita is an Urquicista. Mariquita liked Urquiza. Then, Rosas lost all of his lands, even though the land in his basement, and with anything that wasn't supposed to be the case. So I don't think he was pretty much on his own after that. And as I talk about also in the book, he only wanted to take 2 of his kids with him that he had with Eugenia. She refused to come with just those 2, and they lived a hard life after that, and got some money from Rosas's family, some stuff from Manuelita, I think, over the years. But yeah, so I think as far as I know, I didn't really trace the years and years later, like what happened. I don't know if years later, if Manuelita got anything back. That's a great question. But Rosas, I think during his lifetime, never, except for those initial couple of years when Urquiza was trying to help him, his revenues from his lands were cut off and confiscated. And I think the justification was he had confiscated a lot of lands from, Unitarians and others who opposed him. So hopefully that's, you can write to me also an email, and I can maybe share some more stuff.
And as a Cordobesa, she's really looking forward to reading your book, Erica. She just hasn't gotten a copy of it yet. And William, your book is currently on my nightstand, which will go to her as soon as I'm finished with it.
That is awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bridget. And now, Soledad, you may ask your question directly to the author.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your presentations to all of you and the organizers. And my question is very specific. I think it's for Billy. And when you were talking about your future threats or future research plans, you mentioned these chantas or con artists. And I was wondering, first, which kind of, or what kind of chantas are you willing to research on? And if you are gonna like relate them to the street culture, or also what is the time frame that you are thinking of, like, or the historical setting? I don't know if you can talk a little more about these chantas.
Yeah, I'll just be really brief, I think, with the answer. So this is one of the, I guess, features of specifically the second chapter in the book, when I talk about these hemispheric travelers that that I've always wanted to do just a little bit more with, right? I don't want to continue working on the book. I think Jeff hinted at in his comments that by the end he was, I think you were tired, right, Jeff? I couldn't remember the exact way you put it, but when you got to the author checklist, that was it.
Yeah, the author checklist did it to me. It did me in.
Yeah, the author checklist. I think, yeah, marketing questionnaire, author checklist, and like those parts of the process. So at that point, I was done. But the sort of outstanding areas that I think I could still do a little bit more with are, these charlatans, chantas, and then the Gavino Ezeiza interest. So I'm thinking of I mentioned these professors of the occult or a hypnotist. And oftentimes, these were people who were performing under carpas or they were in theaters. One in particular I tried to follow a little bit is this guy named El Conde de Das, who ended up coming from Spain, apparently with a spouse. And they worked together. They were in Brazil, they were in Uruguay. They got kicked out of Uruguay and went to Argentina. They got kicked out of Argentina, went back to Uruguay, and then over to Peru. I don't know where they went after that. But they oftentimes had trouble with audiences, right? Because audiences would interrupt parts of the shows because they didn't believe what was going on in these things. So, this guy would do all kinds of strange things like accelerate the germination of a plant in a very short amount of time. So there are these weird things that expect audiences to believe what's unbelievable, right? And to try to pull a fast one on people. And for the most part, people ate it up, right? People sort of bought into this bizarre spectacle that was taking place in front of their eyes. So just as far as, where I want to go with that, I'm not exactly sure how far into the 20th century I want to take it. There are lots and lots of names and acts of these types of people that run throughout the sources from the 1800s on into the 1900s. I mentioned the connection to corruption. I don't know how deep I want to get into it. I don't want to make this more than an article. So I'm trying to cut myself off before it becomes too unwieldy.
Okay, yeah, just to mention, Billy, there's also in Semanario de Agricultura y Comercio, there's a lot of reports on charlatans with vaccines, with the introduction of the smallpox vaccines in 1805. There will be a series, the old British invasions of charlatans selling vaccines that were, that was a big concern of the clergy especially. But just to make it more, you're the rabbit hole deeper there. Right?
I hadn't thought of the vaccination effort for smallpox, but it's such a great point. Thank you for mentioning that, Fabricio.
All right, Mike.
Well, hello, thank you. I just actually have more of a comment than a question. And the comment deals with an issue that I think Billy raised in terms of, I think the question he's getting at is why are we writing all these books, right? Or what are going to be the utility of all this, right? And it's an affirmation because I've had the pleasure of assigning books from a lot of people in this room in classes that I've taught. Most recently, Erica's in a fall course on modern Latin America, and I've signed stuff that Billy, of course, has helped produce with the Juan Morera. Years ago, I TA'd with a class where Jeff Chumley's first book was assigned, and Fabricio, I've signed your book, and others. So it's they're well received by students, right? I mean, the students get into this stuff. You're appealing to them. I mean, again, I'm at a regional working class university, and it reaches the students, and so that sort of stuff. Again, I just want to affirm, right? Again, Bridget, I've assigned Bridget's work, both in article and in book form, and so keep it up. I mean, at the very least, right? We have an established market of our students, and we should continue to do so. And the book still serves a function, I think. Although I do agree with Billy, I myself if I ever get around to getting my book manuscript published, whether I would want to do another, but it's good stuff. So keep it up.
Great, thank you. Anybody wants to reply or just a comment? And then
I'll just throw something really quick. I appreciate that, Mike. And we just had this discussion with my students, my world history class. I assigned a book by one of my colleagues on a Catholic bishop in Belgium in the early 1600s. You know, this is World Civ, beginning of the semester. And I always have him come in and talk to the students when, that's my deal with him. I'll use your book if you come and talk, right? And he's probably one of our more prolific scholars. Craig Harleen, maybe some of you have come across his stuff, does stuff on nuns and miracles and archbishops and things like that. And I asked my students after he was left, I said, if, you know, where, you know, he spent 8 years on this book, where would it appear in the textbook? You know, if you were to use this when writing a textbook and they realize, well, it might be a paragraph in a textbook, a world history textbook, or maybe even 2 sentences. But my point to them was that now you can see how we know anything about history is because people are spending a lot of time. And Billy, I don't think you're saying abandon it, but you're saying how can we, you know, maybe do it a little bit different way. But that was also an affirmation too. And I was trying to make that point to the students that the only way we know things in the detail that we know them is historians, you know, well, the experts will read it, but a lot of people might just find it in a paragraph or even a sentence in some textbook, you know. So I don't know if that's encouraging or not, but I think, you know, we need it in some form. And Billy, I think you're saying let's maybe look at different ways of doing it, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. And I really appreciate Mike and thanks for signing. And I mean, I love our books. I love our books. They're incredibly formative, right? In so many ways for us as scholars and teachers. I just wonder, and you know, I think the AHA has done a lot of work, right, in terms of getting people to rethink what dissertations look like and what they can be as far as scholarly products after that. I just think maybe we could amplify the types of books that we write, right? And think of, you know, other formats that maybe wouldn't require, not that they would be any less rigorous, but they wouldn't necessarily require 10 years.
Yeah.
And so that's the question I'm posing.
Absolutely, and I think that there's like a lot. I think that Alex and the databases projects show also a different format there and how it can easily reach out and serve to other, you know, even if like folks that shape public opinions and newspapers and so forth. I think that there is this audience there is definitely something that we should think more about. I agree completely. And going on by Alex Borucki. Yeah, that's your time for a question.
I wanted to know more about Billy, you mentioned this issue of creating something of a digital archive of everyday life in modern Rio de la Plata or street life or street culture. And not to continue with this reflection about the middle age crisis that we are having right now. It's not how you say it, yeah, middle age crisis. These things still are a miracle of sustainability. Son un milagro de la sustentabilidad. You produce these things, the press put the money on these things, and these things are out. As long as these things do not meet fire or water, they are fine. My own experiences with digital humanities is that they are something of a kid. We have seen some of the kids there in the background, and I have heard some of the kids there in the background as well. Once those kids are with you, they are with you forever. And that means that you have to take care in some way of a digital humanities project. Either if you are looking your own institution, your university, but if you want to make this digital humanities initiative sustainable in the long run, you have to attach to some kind of institution that is outside of you, outside of even your university, like a national archives, a library, or something like that. Because if not, it goes kaput. Also, talking about the most positive things, not the kaput part. Tell us about this initiative.
No, I agree. I mean, I guess it's a longer lasting, in some ways, a longer lasting commitment, right? Or could be potentially. And that's why I wonder, about the possibility. I've talked about this with a couple editors, University of Arizona Press, University of New Mexico Press, about the press really sort of taking on the digital piece of this, right? A group of scholars puts together this project that corresponds to the case that I mentioned, right? The history of street cultures, right? We're talking about interactions in the public space, whether it's, social networks and street food, or it's mass mobilization, political protest that we see across Latin America, or the way that street art, graffiti is part of reading the street, or kiosk culture and so forth. And all of those things I think could be used to present something that's digital and can communicate with different audiences in ways that we can't do in books. But I do think it would be sort of the best practices way of doing it would be to connect with a press that would manage the digital component and do the book, right? The linked book project. And so that's where I've started to explore this future project idea, in order not to be saddled with, like you say, having to maintain this or otherwise. I don't know if that's realistic or not, but at least that's my hope.
Great. Thank you. Viviana.
Yes, I will be brief. This is a comment for everybody, but also following up on this question of the sustainability. And I want to echo many of the big points that Bill made. I think in many institutions, we have seen the disinvestment in the humanities and social sciences. And it's true that the careers that we have, those in the middle-age crisis that we have right now, right? The careers that we saw are really hard to replicate, right? Our graduate students are not going to be able to find jobs upon graduation. They're going to have a harder time finding the first contract for their books. And so I think that's an important issue, without putting the book on trial, right? Because the book as a product is a wonderful product. But I think there are ways of rethinking about the profession. And I want to suggest that perhaps we should have a small panel in the next face-to-face or online meeting at the Rio de la Plata seminar, where we can actually workshop these ideas a little deeper. And now I'm going to have my own kind of advertisement moment. I have done my digital humanities turn, and I'm working on a tool for expediting the search in the notarial records, right, in Argentina. So we created a interdisciplinary and international team, and we're working on this tool that will allow us to search more efficiently for content, right? This is a way of serving the field. This is not a way of reaching to the broader public, but the digital humanities has all these layers, right? And another issue that I wanna bring up, my department at UMKC realized long time ago that it was becoming harder and harder to sustain the careers that we had. And so we created a public history program. And out of this idea of public history, primarily pioneered by our US historians and regional historians, because they can engage locally much better than we can. But that doesn't keep us from thinking along those lines and encouraging others to engage in these practices that are legitimate. They need to gain perhaps the same kind of status that the traditional way of doing history right now enjoys, right? But And at the end of the day, it's up to us to make that turn and make it happen and hand it down to the next generation of Rio Platinistas. So those are my comments and my suggestions. You know, maybe create a session within the next Rio de la Plata workshop where we can talk about these opportunities, possibilities. And as I said, the digital humanities are wide, and there are many, many ways of engaging with this. So that's it.
Absolutely, Viviana. And I think that the Rio de la Plata workshop will have new additions to its format. I believe that what I'm seeing here, folks from Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, folks that are also like normally that would be like 20th century folk people that are not, you know, it was not the original group of the colonialists. I think that this dialogue is absolutely fantastic, and I will work with everybody here, but also with the Almo 100 to figure out ways of supporting and keeping like extending this dialogue, and absolutely figuring out how we can move. I believe that I think that Viviana points an important point, that also it's about our fields and institutions, what they recognize as tenure granting achievements, right? And I think that if you look at the arts, a lot of folks, especially in the music departments, CDs, albums are considered as important as a monograph. What are the other works that we are doing? Like not mention like something like these late voyages. That is a massive endeavor, and not necessarily considered in the same level as a book. You know, I'm not sure. Alex probably would know more, but that is involves too this change in the institutional mindset. But well, thank you, folks. Thank you very much for joining us on this beautiful, well, it's a great Saturday for me. I hope the sun is shining in other places. And you stay safe. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you, the authors, for being gracious and joining us here to discuss their work. And each of you who have found time, it was great to see some faces that I haven't seen in a while, and especially to meet so many new people to me, but new colleagues here that I haven't met in the past. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you around, hopefully in person. And yes, stay safe.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Fabricio, Alex, Viviana.
Ciao, ciao.
Gracias, Fabricio.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias a todos.
Gracias,
Los
gracias.
amigos.